Antonio, what was the impetus to actually write the book? Like, was this something you were chronicling as you were going along with the intent of ultimately writing a book? I mean, it's a fascinating, for people that are listening that don't know, it's sort of like I would compare it to like Liar's Poker for the tech world of that time, right? And sort of going through. And so, was it just, hey, this story needs to be told, or were you doing it for your own personal edification as you were going, and then decided it later on?
So Liar's Poker is a great reference because it was definitely an inspiration for it. I love Liar's Poker. For those who don't know, it's Michael Lewis's first book, and it details his life inside Solomon Brothers in like the early days of the bond trading world. Um, I'd like to claim that I was as willful and planned as to like chronicling it while it was happening, thinking I'd do a book. I wouldn't say it was quite as Machiavellian as that. I did think that something would come out of it. My first W-2 like issuing job, believe it or not, was actually as a journalist, as a writer. In high school, I interned at the Miami Herald and the Fort Lauderdale Sun Sentinel. So I was raised in South Florida. And so the writing side of things has always been part of my life. My mother was a librarian. And so that kind of inculcates in you the thought that, life is only real if it ends up as a book on the shelf. And if it isn't, it's kind of a waste. It's kind of an ephemeral thing. And, I don't think that my trajectory through Silicon Valley at the time was particularly exceptional. On the contrary, it was pretty standard at the time. YC company, acqui-hire, find yourself in this ambiguous situation in a large company that's trying to scale. There's a unique opportunity to create something big, mostly drafting off the momentum, obviously, of a bigger company. And I don't know, I was in a lot of interesting meetings and a lot of right rooms at the right time. And it seemed like a waste to not document that, particularly given that if you went back, Liar's Poker is a reference, but it's kind of outside of tech. Probably the only other serious like insider startup book before Chaos Monkeys, I would say, is I don't know if you remember Startup by Jerry Kaplan.
Yeah, sure.
1997. Classic book, still pretty good, I think. It'll make me sound very old, I mean, it was way before my time, but it was like mobile pen computing before the iPhone was a thing. And, I reread it actually. So I wrote part of what became Chaos Monkeys, a book proposal, actually in Berlin. I was living in Berlin. It's a whole other story. But I reread Jerry Kaplan's book Startup, and what was amazing about that book is that he took very particular details. Again, almost everything of the late 90s venture world is now like, dated and kind of a dinosaur. But he extracted a lot of lessons that I think were generalizable. So did Tony Fadell in his recent book Build, by the way. Like a lot of his stories are kind of ancient history, but I think they're still generalizable to stuff today, which is what I tried to do it with Chaos Monkey.
When you were writing it, did you know like, ooh, this is going to be controversial, or was it more of like you knew it going in?
Well, as you know, I think, again, it wasn't that long ago, but there used to be kind of a code of silence inside tech in which you never really talked about the inner workings. I'm not quite sure why, because it's actually not that embarrassing. Like, I remember in one interview around Chaos Monkeys, it introduced me as a whistleblower. I'm like, excuse me, there's no whistle to blow here. There was no fraud that I saw.
Yeah, you were pretty positive on your like experience. I mean, there were individual people you had problems with, but it wasn't like you were exposing Facebook's fraud or something.
Right. There's nothing. There's no actual like negative or egregious behavior in the book. You know what? I getting back to the Berlin story. I'm an EU national in addition to being an American, so I thought, I would be kind of canceled from tech, but only because I kind of spilt the beans on this very important company, and I thought people wouldn't appreciate that. And so I actually wrote it in Barcelona and Berlin thinking, well, if I have to reboot my life in Europe, might as well check out the startup hubs and do like Tech Life #2 in Europe instead. I'm one of the few Americans who actually, threatened to move to Europe and did, and then moved back, which I've done more than once, by the way. And then once the book sold here, I'm like, I guess I'll just stick around here. But yeah, no, I did think it would get me into some trouble and then also, again, Facebook and I are cool now, but at the time there was a little bit of a hostile vibe in the air. And so like, I remember I went to New York to go edit the book with my editor, and there was only one printed copy that she would keep locked in her cabinet because they kind of feared that like Facebook would use its network to get at it because, anyway, it's a long story, but there's a lot of clickety-clacker about it that in retrospect seems totally silly. But yes, there was that in the air at the time.
There was another book that came out around that time in which two of my friends were maybe implicated in trying to get a copy of a book.
Dan Lyons' book. Yes, that's why my editor was so freaked out, because of that. That's right.
Yeah. A book about HubSpot. But so, I mean, honestly, the story itself isn't it's not like the most remarkable journey. Like there's probably thousands of people. I think what's interesting is you just really did not give a fuck in your willingness to talk about all this stuff, right? And I think that's what made it so captivating. And you also, this is an interesting segue, but it's not the guy I know necessarily in the book, right? It is you, but it's a certain version of you. Is that fair?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's heavily stylized, right? It's like the inspiration might have been Jerry Kaplan's Startup, or Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker, but the tone is more Hunter S. Thompson, Tom Wolfe, a little edgier, and so there's definitely a sort of literary persona in it, which, again, I think our culture is at a point where understanding that you're speaking in a certain narrative voice that isn't the actual person, that subtlety gets a little lost. So. But yeah.
You know what's funny is, I mean, honestly, and I told you this before we hopped on, but I went back and listened to all your interviews, or the ones that I could easily get access to. And it's funny, like the passage that ended up being controversial, you actually read it to Kara Swisher on her podcast, which is just like a funny thing, because 5 years later, it ended up being this like aha moment of like, we got you. And it's like, well, I mean, the guy was reading it on the podcast, right? And, has it aged? I think you've admitted you wouldn't write those exact words today, certainly with what has played out, but it was kind of a character, right? And all that. So maybe to the extent, we don't need to go into all the details, because I know you don't want to be defined by this singular experience, but you were at Branch for a little while, right? Doing some writing, and then you ended up at Apple.
Yep.
And you were there for 30 days.
Something like that. Yeah. So Branch Metrics is one of the big attribution providers in tech, which, if you know what that is, it's the people who kind of ingest your data and help parse it for the actual developers and the publishers. And I worked at Apple briefly. Again, it's reliving the whole drama. Doesn't seem like the most useful thing in the world. But yeah, they were extraordinarily surprised to hear about a best-selling book that everyone had positively reviewed just a few years before.
Yeah, and that people had to got calls on references about and all that. But yeah, one passage in particular. What? Not to litigate that specific, like how it played out, and I know there's probably NDAs and stuff that you can't speak about, but to some extent after that, right? One, I think the people that it's been publicly reported, the people that were kind of the Slack group or whatever, have since been removed or fired from the company. I think The Verge reported that. And then two, we've seen this kind of like, there was this mantra of bringing your whole self to work, or whatever, that I think Google kind of was the big one behind. And we can debate whether or not it's a means of just getting people to work all the time, or what exactly it is. But it sort of felt like that was the last, in my mind, sort of the last time there wasn't really an alternative to this. It was sort of the spiraling out of control of like letting a small portion of your population or your employee base kind of hold executives hostage for things that they wanted, without any other course. At least it felt like that.
Yeah, I was the guy who first sprinted through the minefield and stepped on the mine. And then after that, everyone knew where the mine was and avoided the mine.
Yeah.
I mean, the timeline is that after that, Coinbase, Brian Armstrong issued his kind of famous statement saying, we're not doing politics at work. We're a mission-focused company. If you don't like it, here's a nice package, but out the door you go. Even Shopify, again, successful Canadian e-commerce company. They're, kind of very typically soft-spoken, nerdy CEO, came out and said, look, this isn't a family. Gave everyone a very stern talking to. And, I think exhibited the sort of moral leadership that a lot of companies had before. And people understand that, it's odd that we have to reteach ourselves what our 14-year-old grandparents knew, right?
Yeah.
Which is that you don't talk about politics and religion at work or in mixed company unless you want everything to turn into a fucking soap opera, right?
There's this really interesting phenomenon, and I've talked about it with buddies of mine, and you see it in these examples of the loudest voice at a company, or the people who speak out in a political party and have the most things to say, the loudest, or you could even see it inside of, any small team where people pay attention probably significantly too much to the loudest voice in the room, because it's really not exciting to shout about being like a moderate, to have like a normal opinion and to not, it's just, and you see it play out over and over and over again. And I feel like what happened over the course of maybe 8 or 9 years is we forgot that there's like a bigger denominator. Like, yeah, these 4 people are really angry, but guess what? There's like 30,000 other of them that actually really matter. And the same is happening and happened, I would argue, in politics in particular on the both ends of the extremes. Like it's the same thing over and over. You listen to the loudest voice and you kind of forget that it's just a non-random, extremely biased sample of the people who are saying things. That's the same story.
Yeah, and it's odd that I think both the American political system and social media tends to amplify those extreme voices on both left and right, rather than the sort of fat middle that is actually the majority view. And I agree with that. I think people are getting a lot more sophisticated and savvy about it. It's like, again, the classic Verge piece of, oh, employee revolt at company X. And then you look at the number and it's like literally 40 employees in a company of 4,000 people. And it's like, why is this a story? This isn't a company revolt. It's really some microcosm. Like, let's get real. And then in our political system, where I think is a little bit more dangerous, right? Like the political stakes are a lot bigger than the corporate ones. Whether it be, these relatively non-controversial issues like gun control and abortion, and not to be like the European supremacists, because I hate when Europeans lecture Americans, but like somehow in Europe, like somehow laws and public policy converge to what is the polled majority view. And somehow in the United States, it's the opposite. It somehow converges to one of two extremes in which the majority view is probably somewhere in the middle of those two, but that's not the policy you get. And I don't quite understand why that is, but
it's like at a company, it's really easy to be the small group of people shouting, I can't believe you don't have a stance on this issue, because it's a little odd to be screaming like, I just want to do my job. It's like not a thing you post on Slack or wherever. And so you only hear the crazies. And the same again is true in politics, right? It's like the people who want to talk about student debt or whatever. And the reality is like the vast majority of human beings in this world do not give two flying fucks about student debt. Like they don't care. And yet it becomes this like topic of conversation because the loudest voices in the room want to scream about it. It's like the local zoning board, the one guy who doesn't want the building built because the chimney's too high.
So I've talked to some political people, like I have some friends in DC, and they would claim that it's not necessarily a given, that it's first past the post voting and primaries they claim is what extremifies everything, because only the extreme, because I mean the equivalent of the zoning board crazy person is who shows up for primary votes. It's typically the extremes of the party. And then they and then while in the past, I'm not saying this necessarily better, primaries were either closed or literally be decided by committee. And the committee would often say, who's going to win the eventual national vote? And that's a much more centrist candidate by and large. Anyhow, that's one theory. I don't know if it's true. It's kind of above my pay grade to really speculate, but
I think it manifests itself in a lot of different ways of like, if we had a ranked choice system, then it lends itself to a second or third place. I always say in venture capital now, which I think is true in general, it's like, it's much better to be Donald Trump than it is to be Jeb Bush. And what I mean by that, and it's kind of a crazy analogy, but like, it's better to be specialized and deeply appealing to a narrow subset than it is broadly, kind of milk toast to a lot of people, right? Because we're living in this world of infinite choice. And so if you gravitate to an extreme opinion, and I think it's true of cable television and it's true of all the social algorithms, right? Like the extremes get amplified because of, it drives engagement on both sides, right? It drives people that are zealotly or passionately supporting it, and then also the people that are passionately against it. And so it leads to comments and clicks and all that stuff.
Used to be you had to be the guy that goes to the town square and like gets on a box and actually like shouts this stuff out loud. And now you can just post a meme.
Hey, Tony, you had a funny quote that Facebook is the real community as porn is the real sex, which I feel like is I think that kind of works here. It's not like real community. These aren't like real interactions, right?
Well, hold on. So that quote is from like ages ago. I think it's from 2016 or 2017. But what spurred that, let me tell you what spurred it. You're digging up ancient history, so I'll dig up the ancient history context. At the time, I was living on Orcas Island, which is this tiny little island community. I was not raised in a small community. I was raised in Miami. And so it was my first experience of community life. And real community is different, right? Like you don't check into a place. You just go to the one bar that's open and everyone who's out is there. Like it's like I walked in the door and everyone knows I'm there. Privacy kind of doesn't exist in a small community because if if you're reclusive about things, people treat it with mistrust. Like, what are you hiding? Right? Like, I need to know who you are, who your kids are, what you're doing. But of course, in exchange, everything doesn't turn so negative because you've got to see that person in like the grocery line the next day, right? So you can't just sit there and troll them because there's like a real cost to being an asshole. I mean, there were assholes on Orcas as well. I'm not saying it's a utopia, but kind of everyone knew who they were and they suffered the penalties of being an asshole. And they didn't, create a media career about being an asshole. Like, being an asshole doesn't work as a long-term strategy. And so just seeing that, I realized that that's kind of fake. Now, fast forward several years, Logan, I don't know. I'm more lukewarm to that sentiment because, like, maybe this is just me as a rootless cosmopolitan living in my little elite bubble, but it's like, I don't know where half the friends I have live anymore. Like, I don't know where they actually are. We just convene in certain cities, in one of 3 or 4 neighborhoods in certain cities. Like, I was talking about this with Balaji because he has this book about the network state, about this whole networked federation of urban whatever. And it's like, I kind of already live that way. And, would you call that fake? I don't know. I feel relatively close to these people. I don't know. I would quibble with my own quote maybe now, years into this.